And so I don't think Freud's critique really holds water in the final analysis. And then Marx's critique, of course, was that religion was the opiate of the masses, and he made an argument that was similar to Freud's, although somewhat earlier, and based upon the presupposition that religious beliefs were stories told to the gullible masses in order to keep them pacified and happy while their corporate overlords, for lack of a better purpose, continued to exploit them and weaken them. And you know, I find the critique of human institutions as driven entirely by power very, let's say, questionable to say the least. And of course, every human institution is corrupt by for one reason or another, and it's also corrupt specifically by such things as deception and arrogance and the demand for unearned power. And the same thing, of course, can be applied to religious systems, but that doesn't mean that they are in some special way characteristic of those faults. And maybe you think they are, and you know, maybe you can make a case for it, but it's not prima facie, I think that's how you say that, evident that that also is a particularly useful criticism. I don't buy it. I think that's far too cynical. I think that the people who wrote these stories, first of all, what are you going to do? You're going to run a bloody conspiracy for 3,000 years successfully? It's like, good luck with that. You can't run a conspiracy for 15 minutes without somebody ratting you out. You know, it's impossible. So whatever's at the basis of the construction, not only of these stories, but of the dogmatic structures that emerged from them, I think that it's a terrible mistake to reduce them to unidimensional explanations. In fact, I generally think that reducing any complex human behavior to a unidimensional explanation is often the sign of a seriously limited thinker. And you know, I say that with some caution because Freud did do that with religion, at least to some degree, and Freud was a serious thinker, and Marx, I suppose, was a serious thinker too, even though, well, yeah, he's someone if you have any sense, Marx just leaves you speechless. So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race. I had an interesting letter this week from someone. I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd been following my lectures and noted that I had been making what you might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition or speaking of a different religious tradition couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, in the Taoist view of being as, you know, the eternal balance between chaos and order. One thing I didn't tell you, I don't think about that, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a neuropsychologist named Elkonin Goldberg who was a student of Alexander Luria, and Luria was, I think, the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. He was a Russian, and he was one of the first people to really determine, in large part, the function of the frontal cortex, which was quite a mystery for a very long period of time. And Goldberg, you know how we have two hemispheres, right? We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and people often think of the left for right-handed people, right-handed males more particularly, because women are more neurologically diffuse. It's one of the things that makes them more robust to head injury, for example. And maybe men are less diffuse and somewhat more specialized, which makes them a bit more specialized, but a little more subject to damage. Anyways, we have two hemispheres, left and the right, and no one exactly knows why. And we know that they house quasi-independent consciousnesses, because if you divide the corpus callosum that unites them, which was done in cases of intractable epilepsy, for example, that each hemisphere is capable of developing its own consciousness to some degree, the right generally nonverbal and the left verbal. And so there has been this idea that the left is a verbal hemisphere and the right is a nonverbal hemisphere. But that can't be right because, of course, animals don't talk and they have a bifurcated hemisphere. So if it's right, it's not causally right. Now, Goldberg hypothesized instead that the hemispheres were specialized for routinization and non-routinization, or for novelty and familiarity, or for chaos and order. And so that's pretty damn cool. When I ran across that, I also thought about that as a signal of what would you call it? Multi-method, multi-trait construct validation, because I'd never thought of the hemispheres as operating that way, and Goldberg came up with this in a historical pathway that was entirely independent from any mythologically inspired thinking, completely independent. In fact, it was motivated more by materialist Russian neuropsychology, which was materialist for political reasons and also for scientific reasons. But the idea is that we have one hemisphere that reacts very rapidly to things we don't know, and it's more imaginative and diffuse, and it's associated more with negative emotion, because negative emotion is what you should feel immediately when you encounter something you don't understand. Because it's a form of thinking, right? Negative emotion. It's like, I'm somewhere where things aren't what they should be. Right hemisphere does that, generates images very rapidly to help you figure out what might be there. And then the left hemisphere takes that and develops it into something that's more articulated and algorithmic and fully understood. And so then there's this dynamic balance between the right and the left hemisphere, where the left tries to impose order on the world. That's Ramachandran, who's a neurologist in California, a very famous neurologist, who also developed a theory like Goldberg's, who said that the left hemisphere imposes routinized order on the world, and the right hemisphere generates novelty and reacts to novelty and generates novel hypotheses. And he thought, and there is some good evidence for this, that's what's happening during the dream is that information is moved from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere in small doses, basically, so that the novel revelations of the right hemisphere don't demolish the algorithmic structures that the left hemisphere has so carefully put together. So and I like that theory too, because it also does help justify the hypothesis that I've been laying out for you, which is that, you know, there's part of us that extends ourselves out into the world and tries to understand what we don't know, and that part extends itself out with behavior and also with emotion and also with image, and then maybe with poetry, and then maybe with storytelling, and then as that develops, then we develop more and more articulated representations of that emergent knowledge. And so you can map that quite nicely onto the neurologists and the neuropsychologists' presumption about what constitutes the reason for the hemispheric differentiation. But the other thing that's so cool about the hemispheric differentiation argument, as far as I'm concerned, and this is worth thinking about, man, because it's a real, there's a word that Ned Flanders uses for that. Noggin scratcher? I think it's something like that. Anyways, you know, we do make the assumption that what it is that we are biologically adapted to is reality, right? It's actually an axiomatic definition if you're a Darwinian, because nature is what selects. By definition, that's what nature is. It's what selects. And if the nature that selects has forced upon you a dual hemispheric structure because half of you has to deal with chaos and half of you has to deal with order, then you can make a pretty damn strong inferential case that the world is made out of chaos and order. And that's really something to think about, man, you know. So you can think about that for a while if you want. So anyways, for whatever reason, there is a lot packed into these stories. And so let's investigate a couple more of them. We'll start with this story of Adam and Eve. Now, you may remember that the Bible is a series of books. Bible actually means something akin to library, and these books were written by all sorts of different people and groups of people and groups of editors and groups of people who edited over and over across very, very large periods of time. So they're authored by no one and many at the same time. There was a tradition for a long time that the earliest books were written by Moses, but that's probably not technically correct, even though it might be dramatically correct, let's say, or correct in the way that a fairy tale is correct. And I'm not trying to put down fairy tales by saying that. there's a number of authors, and the way the authors have been identified, tentatively, is by certain stylistic commonalities across the different stories, different uses of words, like the words for God, different poetic styles, different topics, and so forth. And people have been working for probably 200 years, roughly that, to try to sort out who wrote what and how that was all cobbled together. But it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What matters is that it's an aggregation of collected narrative traditions, and maybe you could say it's an aggregation of collected narrative wisdom.